When it comes to game releases, but not much else, 2020 is a year that's very easily to be enamored by. Thanks to a number of excellent games released over the course of the last 12 months, many of which have been widely anticipated for many years, we can safely say that the 8th console generation was sent out with a bang. But of course, as is the case with any year, there were plenty of bad games that we had the misfortune of playing as well. Some that failed to live up to expectations, some that looked underwhelming right out the gate, and others that rightly flew under the radar for most people. Those are the games that we're going to be talking about here. So without further ado, here are the worst games of 2020. 13. 13's 2020 remake could not have done a worse job of paying homage to the original if it had tried. Terrible AI and bland shooting mechanics are cardinal sins that no shooter should commit, but 13 commits them on a regular basis. Add to that a number of terrible technical issues, many of which makes the game flat out unplayable, in addition to an aesthetic that doesn't pop nearly as much as the original game's visuals did. And what you're left with is a broken mess of a game that had no right to release in the state that it did. OVERPASS. Given how crowded the racing simulation genre has become over the last few years, and how many of those releases we see in this space are legitimately excellent, any new title in this genre has to do a lot to be able to stand out. Not only does OVERPASS not stand out, it simply falls flat on its face. The concept of leaning hard into authenticity and off-road driving mechanics in a simulator sounds great, but OVERPASS, when you actually get down to playing it, feels too meandering, too slow, to the point of being uninteresting. It doesn't help that the game doesn't have an awful lot of content on offer, because that means there's even fewer reasons to stick around. Gigantosaurus the Game. No one was really expecting Gigantosaurus the Game to be anything special. If you were even aware of its existence, you were probably expecting it to be a middling release at best, given its nature as a kid-friendly licensed game. That it failed even those expectations really says something about its quality. Playing the game is an exercise in patience, thanks to its completely bland and uninteresting gameplay, while poor visuals and technical issues serve as the rotten cherry on top of this expired sundae. The Elder Scrolls Blades. The promise of a full-fledged The Elder Scrolls game on your mobile screen is a salivating one. A few days into the game's early access launch in 2019, it became clear that the game would fall way short of that promise, though there was still hope that it could at least be a decent pick-up-and-play experience. Well, it launched in full earlier in 2020 on mobile devices and Switch, and it absolutely did not turn out that way. Blades was repetitive, grindy, unrewarding, and shoddily made. Almost no part of the game was fun to engage with, and what it really was a game that was using its mobile-first nature as a paper-thin veil to disguise its many issues. WARCRAFT 3 REFORGED. WARCRAFT 3 REFORGED has been on the receiving end of a barrage of criticism ever since it came out in the early days of 2020. We here at GamingBolt certainly have not shied away from calling the game out on its many issues. But given how stupendously it bungles the remastering of one of the most legendary strategy games of all time, it's not surprising that people are still miffed about it. Shoddy remastering, technical issues, changes made to the original that made no sense, poor handling of user-generated content, and literally replacing the original game's client. REFORGED does almost everything it possibly can to be counted amongst some of the worst games we've played this year. Bright Memory. We don't want to be too harsh on Bright Memory here. It's essentially a 50-minute long demo made by a single person in his spare time, and it's got some interesting ideas that never really fully reach their potential. But though it deserves props for sheer effort, its many issues are still inexcusable. The game's console optimization was terrible. Its story made no sense whatsoever, enemies are bullet sponges and take away from how punchy the combat feels otherwise. And it feels like the game just keeps throwing in ideas that it thinks might be cool, but never really does anything with them. The real deal, Bright Memory Infinite, is coming out in 2021, and hopefully it'll be much better. But if this slice is anything to go by, we might be in for a bumpy ride. Tennis World Tour 2. Big Ant Studios' Tennis World Tour in 2018 was a truly terrible game. Tennis World Tour 2 launched this year, and it was less terrible, but never really coalesced into something that could be called anything more than mediocre. On the mechanics front, imprecise controls and an inconsistent swinging mechanic were two big issues, while in other areas, a disappointing career mode and bland visuals were disappointments as well. What Tennis World Tour 2 ended up becoming, then, was a game that could hold the attention of neither hardcore nor casual fans of the sport. Was it a step up from the first game? Well, sure, but clearly there's still plenty of room for improvement. Remothered Broken Porcelain. Remothered Broken Porcelain is, true to its name, a broken mess. Frustrating stealth mechanics, terrible enemy AI, obtuse design choices, and generic, uninspired missions make for a game that insists on frustrating its players every step of the way, while an incoherent story told in surprisingly poor fashion means that there aren't a lot of other reasons to stick around outside of gameplay either. Disaster Report 4 Plus. Due to unfortunate circumstances that no one could have controlled, Disaster Report 4 Plus went through quite a lot of upheaval during development, leading to multiple delays. That set perhaps an unfair amount of expectation upon the game, expectations that really it was never going to meet. Even in the absence of that context, however, Disaster Report 4 Plus is just a fundamentally flawed game. Its boring quests, awful controls, and repetitive design combine for gameplay that is the opposite of fun, while a litany of technical issues just pile on even more problems to an already problematic game. Hunting Simulator 2. It's not often that we come across a game that has so few redeeming qualities that we find it hard to recommend to virtually anyone. Hunting Simulator 2 is one such game. Aimlessly wandering around in its environments can be oddly meditative, and you have a cute dog to accompany you, but that's about it as far as the good stuff is concerned, because there's just so much aimless wandering. Hunting Simulator 2 is a very goalless game, and even beyond that, it seems like its mechanics are at odds with what the game wants to be, because even if you do engage with those mechanics, you're never really rewarded in any meaningful way. Fast and Furious Crossroads. From the moment Fast and Furious Crossroads was first revealed at 2019's The Game Awards, it was clear that this wasn't going to be anyone's favorite game upon launch. Well, at least it didn't disappoint us. Not only does Fast and Furious Crossroads look bad enough to have been little more than a decent-looking game 15 years ago, it's also just no fun to play. It's repetitive, the multiplayer was dead on arrival, the driving is hardly ever enjoyable, the story is ridiculous, and the game runs like crap. Steer clear of this one. Someday You'll Return. What do you want from a horror game most of all? For it to be scary? For it to have an interesting story? For it to have tense, mechanically solid gameplay? Someday You'll Return fails on all of these fronts. It's a game that could lure you in with its premise that is admittedly quite interesting on paper, but the actual game itself is anything but. At best, it's tropey and forgettable, and at worst, it's completely uninteresting, to the point of being mind-numbingly boring. Rugby 20. Unlike basketball, American football, and actual football, rugby has been poorly represented in video games for far too long. And though Rugby 20 might seem like a good option for fans of the sport by default, it's really rather disappointing. It can be occasionally fun to play, of that there's little doubt, but that fun wears off quickly because this is a game that has little else going for it. It doesn't look great, the selection of modes is minuscule, the presentation is bland. In the end, there's so much room for improvement that perhaps rugby fans would have been better served by a game that had taken an additional year in development to release in a much better state, even if that release had come a bit belatedly. Deadly Premonition 2. The original Deadly Premonition is a classic example of a game that's so bad, it's good. Deadly Premonition 2 tried to do that exact same thing, but lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. Instead, it ended up being a game that was just bad. Well, not entirely bad, it still had some stuff going for it, and that trademark unhinged sweary touch is still in there for fans of his work. But there's just so much that bogs down Deadly Premonition 2. Most of all, a laundry list of technical issues that can make the game unplayable at times. If we do ever get a third Deadly Premonition game, which seems unlikely at this point, hopefully it'll try to replicate the understated successes of the first game by aping its strengths, not its weaknesses. G.I. Joe Operation Blackout. Again, given G.I. Joe Operation Blackout's nature as a licensed product, and how not very special it looked before launch, no one was really expecting this game to blow anyone's socks off. If you're a fan of the property who wants a healthy dose of nostalgia, there might be something for you here. But if you're looking for a decent third-person shooter, look elsewhere. G.I. Joe Operation Blackout had poor shooting mechanics, repetitive missions that got boring way too quickly, bland visuals with uninteresting environments, and a long list of other issues that were not at all easy to ignore. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.